So Black Myth: Wukong is an upcoming single-player action RPG developed in Unreal Engine 4 by the Chinese indie studio called Game Science. And I know what you're thinking, Chinese game studio, AAA games, that can't possibly sound right, can it? Well, I mean, we have a 13-minute new gameplay video that has been posted by the company online, and I think that I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that literally everybody who saw it genuinely got really excited for it, because the gameplay looks amazing, it looks like it has some really rich story to tell, but even more so, it looks absolutely amazing, even though the game is in a very early stage of development. So in this video I want to talk about everything you need to know about this video game, about the gameplay, the mechanics, how soon can you expect it, and everything else in regards to its development. So let's jump right into it, and as always, a thumbs up on this video would be super appreciated. Now, as I've said, this is a single player action adventure RPG that has been in development since 2017. The game is planned to be a one-time purchase only, so there's not going to be any microtransactions at all. In fact, the developers have even made sure to emphasize the no microtransactions part. There is a possibility that if the game fares well in sales and whatnot, that we might get to see some form of DLC sometimes after release. There's no planned release date as of yet. It's very likely that the game is at least 2 years out at this point, but it is planned to come out on PC, the mainstream consoles, and also possibly on some of the cloud gaming platforms too. So it's very likely that sometimes around 2022 we might get to see this as a PC, Xbox, PlayStation, and maybe Google Stadia release, assuming that Stadia survives up until then. Now, as far as development goes, this has been developed by the Chinese indie studio called Game Science, and if you've been wondering why you haven't heard about these, then don't worry, because we haven't heard about them either, and that's because it's a relatively new studio. It's been founded around 2014 by ex-Tencent game staff. Tencent, of course, being that huge conglomerate that basically has investments in most of the big gaming companies. So they own Riot Games, which developed League of Legends, they own about 40% of Epic Games, which, I mean, it goes without saying that they have developed Fortnite, and there's a ton more in there that they have in terms of investments. Now, what is cool about this is the fact that the game actually takes heavy inspiration from awesome games that I really enjoyed playing, like God of War 4, Monster Hunter World, and even more so Sekiro. Even if you look at the gameplay, there are some heavy inspirations from those as well. Especially the boss fights, some of them really remind me of Sekiro. The other ones, like the huge ones, really remind me like a combination between Monster Hunter World, but even more so Shadow of the Colossus, especially those huge ones. Yeah, they definitely remind me of that, while the combat itself reminds me of God of War, especially in terms of fluidity, the animation quality, and even more so the impact and the types of abilities that the characters use against the enemies. So really high quality for an indie studio recently created from China, and it looks like the studio is going to expand even more in the upcoming months and years. So I think that it's safe to assume that there's quite a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes to make this game great, and I really hope that we get to see this coming to fruition. As far as the story goes, the game is heavily based on Chinese mythology, and to be more specific, on the classical Chinese novel called Journey to the West. It's basically, I mean, it's obvious from the main character, which is Wukong. It's also the main character from that novel I was talking about, basically the Monkey King that has been a huge part of the media for quite some time. There's even like games out there that have put a heavy emphasis on it, and I think that this is a perfect opportunity to create a game that heavily focuses on him, because it's definitely a very overpowered character if you read the mythology or if you played any of the games that include him, and it definitely sounds like something that would fit a universe that is heavily inspired by God of War, since this is also about gods and like demigods and really powerful characters that go in and fight these gods to begin with. Moving on though, in terms of combat and abilities, the game puts a heavy focus on high impact combat with a very wide mix of both regular attacks as well as magical abilities. So according to the studio, in the final game you will have 72 main abilities in total to choose from, as well as upgrade, some of which were already seen in the gameplay video too. Like for example, you can see the character pulling off a ton of really awesome types of abilities, combos, heavy attacks, light attacks. Of course, since it is heavily inspired by games like Sekiro and God of War, you do have a parry and a dodge button as well, and you will have to make use of these two, since this seems to be a really high skill type of combat specific to these types of games. Just like in the novel, your staff is going to be your main weapon of choice, but you also have other types of abilities in there too, like one of them being that transformation ability. You can basically transform in most of the creatures in the world, at least that's how the novel goes. In the game we can see a number of transformations. One of them is into one of these insects, which seems to be very good at basically bypassing enemies and kind of avoiding detection. Looks really awesome. I kind of like the zoomed in camera and the fact that you can go in this world and everything appears so much bigger. But later down the line we can also see Wukong also transforming into a much bigger version of himself. You don't get to use the staff in that form, but you do gain new melee abilities, and it seems that it's the appropriate form that you might want to use if you're overwhelmed by the number of enemies, or if you just want to like deal more damage and whatnot according to the footage at hand. You can also charge up your staff, by the way, and charge it up until you can release a really powerful blow. It seems that it's also perfectly suited for more AoE type of damage, but there's also more acrobatic types of skills also with the staff, where you kind of jump in the air. It also lets you easily avoid damage, especially the ones on the ground level, and then immediately follow up with slams and other types of attacks on the enemy. There also seems to be a huge emphasis on RPG elements, not just those 72 main abilities, but also what you get from defeating bosses. We saw one of these sequences right here where you kind of fight this mini boss. It seems that that mini boss has a fire staff in his or her hand, and once you take that boss down, you do get to unlock that ability that you can later on use against other bosses. It looked really awesome. Later on we can see this boss fight where Wukong basically pulls out the fire staff and he gets to use it against the boss fight itself, which looks really freaking cool. And presumably there's going to be more other bosses that are going to provide other similar types of rewards. There's a lot being shown in the trailer. Of course, expect a ton of really unique boss fights. We've seen a handful of these in the gameplay video that genuinely looked quite difficult, to say the least. If you've played Sekiro, you probably know what a difficult boss fight looks like, and this looks like pretty close to that. Let's be honest, it looks pretty close to that. And there's a number of bosses that you can find in the game. Some of them are smaller size, like the ones that we saw extensive gameplay footage of, but there's also these huge ones that you basically can't even comprehend how big they are. And this is why I've said that there is a possible comparison to Shadow of the Colossus, since it does look like it's heavily inspired from a game like that. You're basically climbing up these huge bosses and you need to like deal damage to them and eventually have to take them down in one way or another, while you're just the size of an ant compared to them. I will say this about the combat though: the fluidity so far, even though it is in its early stage, looks really awesome. There are a few problems here and there that I've noticed in the gameplay footage, but for something that's so early on, it looks really high quality. It looks like it's going to have a ton of impact. There is a bit of work to be done on how enemies react to attacks. Like, it seems that they don't have impact to reaction at all, but I think that can easily be fixed, and they are basically so early on in the development stage. Otherwise, graphic wise, it just looks gorgeous. I think this is something that shouldn't be used as a means to judge if a game is going to turn out good or not. I mean, graphics isn't obviously all, but even at this stage the game looks like it has potential. It could be a really awesome, let's just say, release on the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X and make use of the brand new technologies behind the new generation of consoles. I also want to touch on the subject of traversal, since this seems to be a pretty big part of it. It seems that the world is much bigger than even I initially anticipated. At some point we can see the character just traveling through a section of a jungle, but later down the line we can see that Wukong is traveling on a cloud, and there's like this huge vast opened area with a big serpent in the background. By the way, again, huge inspiration from Sekiro. So it looks really awesome. I'm really glad that there's somebody who is actually putting an emphasis on Chinese mythology. There are some really great stories to be told, there are some really great characters, and like a ton of history that could make a really great game. It's just that somebody needs to make a proper game out of it. Hopefully Black Myth Wukong is going to be one of them. I will surely cover more when we find out more about it. Of course, in the meantime, I definitely urge you to go ahead and check out the 13-minute gameplay trailer that has been posted online. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, it would be super awesome if you left a like on it. Also consider subscribing and activating that notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next one.